Being buried alive is one of the most terrifying ways to die. We all hope that when we're buried, we're dead. Perhaps it's understandable that the spirit of someone who was buried prematurely may be hesitant to leave this world. That's why their ghosts still linger about this plane of existence. These are 3 creepy hauntings of people who were buried alive. Did you know that we're on social media? You can find us at facebook.com/criminallylisted and at criminally_listed on Instagram. Make sure you follow us to stay up to date on the latest news. Number 3. Julia Legare, Edisto Island, North Carolina. It's true. 22-year-old Julia Legare died in 1852. Born Julia Georgiana Seabrook, she married John Berwick Legare. They had a kid named Hugh Swenton Legare. From there, the legend takes over. Julia became sick on Edisto Island, about 45 miles south of Charleston. She had diphtheria, which in the 1800s could be a death sentence. She fell into a coma. Her pulse must have been so faint that it couldn't be found. She must have been breathing so shallow that it seemed that she wasn't breathing, because the doctor pronounced her dead. To prevent the spread of disease, bodies were quickly buried. Embalming wasn't widely practiced, so Julia was interred that day. She was placed in her family's stone mausoleum in the Edisto Island Presbyterian Church Cemetery. The heavy marble door to the crypt was sealed. Sadly, her son, Hugh, died in 1854. So the mausoleum was reopened. The family was shocked to see Julia's body near the door. Her body had moved from where they laid her to rest. There were claw marks on the door and her fingers were scratched to the bone. They realized she must have been entombed alive. It was clear that this time she was dead, but apparently not gone forever. Hugh's remains were interred. Julia's remains were re-entombed. The door was shut again. One day, a visitor noticed the door to the crypt was open. Cemetery workers shut the door again and locked it. Another day, the door was open and the lock was broken. So the door was shut, locked, and chained. Another day, the door was open and the lock and chain were broken. The door was shut and workers blocked the door with a boulder that only heavy equipment could move. But the boulder was moved and the door was opened again. So Julia's family removed the marble door and then inserted it into the mausoleum's floor. It's still there today. John died in 1856. Now all 3 family members have tombstones in the mausoleum. And no door has ever been installed again because it seems Julia's spirit wants to make sure she's never locked in again. Number 2. Mary Howe, Damariscotta, Maine. The legend of Mary Howe has haunted the town of Damariscotta, Maine for 140 years. Was Mary Howe buried alive or not? The proof might be in the paranormal. Mary was born in 1831 and she was one of 9 children. The family built the Howe House on Elm Street and operated a stagecoach inn and tavern. Mary and her brother, Edwin, took over running the business once their dad died and added seances to the menu in the 1870s. Mary was a medium and would go into trances when connecting with the spirit world. When she would snap out of the trance, she had messages for the living. One time a woman visited Mary and asked her when she would see a relative who was visiting in New York. Mary told the woman that the man won't return. That night, the man died. One day, Mary jumped off the stairs with her arms spread wide. When she landed, she broke her ankle and spoke in a strange language. Her theatrics and predictions dazzled visitors and made their inn popular. Over the decade, they conducted seances. Edwin and Mary eventually sold the original Howe house and moved into a house on Hodgin Street. It was in that home, in December 1882, that 50-year-old Mary fell into a trance. It was common for her trances to go on for hours or even days, but she would eventually come out of them. Throughout the week, Mary stayed in her trance and visitors marveled at her, wondering whom she was seeing in the afterlife. Another week passed, and Mary still hadn't woke up from her trance. Mary became the talk of the town. The town council sent physician Dr. Robert Dixon to find out if Mary was in a trance or dead. In 1882, bodies were supposed to be buried quickly to prevent disease. So Dr. Dixon promptly visited the Howe house. He determined that Mary didn't have a heartbeat. It seemed like she wasn't breathing. But the strangest part was that her skin looked natural. Her limbs were still flexible. There were no signs of rigor mortis or decomposition. But Dr. Dixon pronounced Mary dead. Edward and the townspeople protested. They all thought Mary was still alive. They begged for her not to be buried. But the townspeople did not influence those in power. The doctor had made a decision, and Mary would be buried. Dr. Dixon, the county sheriff, came to the Howe house with a coffin to collect Mary's body. They nailed the coffin shut and brought her to the hillside cemetery. Employees of the hillside cemetery wouldn't accept Mary's body because they believed she was still alive. So the town workers brought in gravediggers from out of town who didn't know Mary's story. But the gravediggers soon discovered that Mary might still be alive, and they refused to dig her grave. Out of options, the town workers dug the grave themselves. They covered the grave with sod to conceal it, and so no one could dig her up. Her grave was left unmarked. Historical reports suggest she's buried at Glidden Cemetery in Newcastle, Maine. That cemetery is about 3 miles from Damerscada, but it's not known for sure. Newcastle locals said that after Mary Howe was buried, they heard muffled screams coming from the cemetery. Legend has it that people who walk over Mary's unmarked grave hear screams of agony coming from the ground. Dogs who walk over her supposed grave stop on top of it, look up at the sky, and howl. Legend also has it that an exorcism was performed on the Howe house to release Mary's spirit. But it seems she still haunts the building. The Howe house is now an apartment complex. Resident Joe Lane is sure he saw Mary Howe's ghost fly down the stairs. Local writer and paranormal investigator Greg Latimer has been investigating Mary Howe's story for years. He was trying to find her grave and mark it with a headstone. There are no plans to exhume her body if and when she's found. Number 1. Samuel R. Jocelyn, Wilmington, North Carolina. Samuel Jocelyn was a well-liked young man with good morals. His dad was a respected lawyer in the city of Wilmington, North Carolina. Jocelyn's best friend was Alexander Hostler. They often had deep conversations about psychological, metaphysical, and philosophical matters. In 1809, Jocelyn and Hostler discussed whether spirits and the living could communicate. They ended the conversation by agreeing that whoever died first would try contacting the living friend. Sadly, that fate would come too soon to Jocelyn. In March 1810, Jocelyn and his new wife, Mary Ann Simpson, went to a hunting lodge 8 miles from town. They got into a fight, so Jocelyn left on his horse. It was in the middle of the night, and it was frigidly cold. There were no lights along the road. The next day, 2 men in a carriage found Jocelyn unconscious on a road near Wilmington. He was lying in 4 inches of water. His body was cold. His horse was found grazing nearby. The men brought Jocelyn home. It's presumed the horse got spooked and knocked Jocelyn off his back. Jocelyn likely fell, hit his head, went unconscious, and froze. But Jocelyn was pronounced dead. He was buried at St. James Church in town. Hostler was devastated by the death of his friend. 2 nights after Jocelyn's funeral, Hostler was alone in his room. He was thinking about the loss of his friend. Then Jocelyn's apparition appeared. Jocelyn said, "How could you let me be buried alive when I was not dead?" Hostler responded in terror, "Not dead?" Jocelyn said, "No, I was not. Open the coffin, and you will see I am not lying in the position in which you placed me." Hostler didn't know what to make of his experience. He thought that maybe he was overcome with grief and tricked himself into seeing Jocelyn. So he didn't tell anyone about his experience. The next night, Hostler was again in his room thinking about Jocelyn. Suddenly, Jocelyn appeared again. He repeated the line, "How could you let me be buried when I was not dead?" Hostler was scared, but he convinced himself he just had an active mind. He thought that if he told his friends, they would think he was playing a cruel joke on them, and he didn't want to make it seem like he was taking advantage of his friend's grief, so he didn't tell anyone. On the 3rd night, Hostler was in his room, and Jocelyn appeared again. This time, Jocelyn pleaded with Hostler to have his death investigated. Hostler finally followed his ghostly friend's word. The next day, Hostler told his friend, Louis Toomer, about his experience. Toomer believed Hostler. Toomer suggested they should have Jocelyn's body exhumed. The pair told Jocelyn's parents about Hostler's experience. Jocelyn's parents asked that the exhumation happen privately. At midnight the next night, Hostler and Toomer went to St. James Church and dug up their friend's grave. They opened the coffin and examined the body with a lantern. They were horrified by what they found. Jocelyn was now lying on his stomach, and one side of the coffin had been slightly loosened. Jocelyn's fingers were bloody, and some of his fingernails had fallen off from trying so hard to open the lid. Samuel Jocelyn had been buried alive. He had suffocated to death in the coffin. Jocelyn seemed to have kept his promise to Hostler by contacting him from beyond the grave. Unfortunately, it's his grave that killed him in the first place. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. If you did find it interesting, please make sure you subscribe. We'll have a new video about the paranormal every week. If you just discovered this channel, please make sure you check out our other channel, Criminally Listed. We have over 325 videos featuring bizarre but true crime stories. You can find it at youtube.com/criminallylisted. We also have a podcast about cold cases that were eventually solved called Criminally Listed Presents Into the Killing. You can find it on Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and anywhere you find great podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.